What's up, guys? Welcome to Whiskey. I'm Jeff. This is a channel where I offer my thoughts and opinions on a specific whiskey, and every once in a while throw on other whiskey-related content. Today we're doing a list of whiskey milestones. I need water. Okay, so whiskey milestones. What does that mean? This is just going to be covering some of the bottles that were very integral to my whiskey journey. And I realized that whiskey journey always sounds incredibly pretentious, but it still sounds better than my slow spiral into alcoholism, so I'm keeping it. Now, obviously, I am just kidding there. I am not an alcoholic. I only drink alcohol frequently, and I only do it as a coping mechanism. I'm still kidding. I probably shouldn't joke about that stuff. Once a week. That's actually how much I drink. Anyways, I've obviously had quite a bit of whiskey over the years. Some have been great, some not so great. These ones are, I'm not saying they're great now. They might have once been, and maybe they're not so great now. Maybe they're still great. We're not really emphasizing the quality of where these bottles are at now. But at the time, I certainly loved them. They set me on a path, and they were very important for, I've got to say it again. They were important for my whiskey journey. I think like a lot of you guys out there, I had various phases to my journey. For a while, I'd be into this thing, then I'd be into that thing. And eventually you do reach a point where, even though you still have your preferences and you might lean towards a certain style, because you've been through all of those phases, you can appreciate a little bit of everything. I mean, unless you can't. That's me. I don't know you. Anyway, the styles of whiskey that I'll be addressing in this video in order of appearance are, we've got bourbon. Not bourbon matured whiskey, just straight up bourbon. We've got sherried whiskeys, peated and sherried whiskeys. We've got straightforward peated whiskeys. We've got complex and aged whiskeys. We have coastal whiskeys. We have bourbon matured whiskeys. And finally, dirty and or funky. So yeah, these are the bottles that kind of set me in a certain direction. They sold me on a specific style of whiskey. What's cool about this list is that most, although not all of these bottles are still around. They're still available. They're still on the market. And for the most part, I still recommend them. And yeah, I guess that's our intro covered. As usual, guys, I do have a mystery pour in the glass. Your hint for as to what this is this was one of the first world whiskeys that really got me exploring whiskey producing regions outside of Scotland. It's an interesting whiskey. Stick around to the end of the list. I'll share with you what that is. And that's it. Let's jump into our list. In the meantime, if you'll kindly leave a like down below, that would be greatly appreciated. So we'll start things off with an honorable mention. This is the bourbon category, and the first bourbon that really got its hooks into me, that really sold me on what bourbon could be, is Jack Daniel's Single Barrel. Now, I don't know, it could be the case that a lot of bourbon connoisseurs out there are laughing at me. I don't know if this enjoys a good reputation or not, but I liked it. I think this was the first bottle of bourbon that I bought that was more upscale. You know, I was used to drinking maybe like a Jack and Coke or Jim Beam and Coke. So there was a lot of and Coke, a cola. But after I tried this, I thought, okay, that's actually quite interesting. And I started getting a little bit more into bourbon. I actually did have a bourbon phase, but this was way back in the day. The reason bourbon is just an honorable mention now is because it's not really a scene that I know too much about. And I don't drink that much bourbon, but I still enjoy the occasional bourbon. And this one just happened to be the one that got me into it. And I still like it. Cool bottle too. Okay, so we're starting off chronologically, and the first style of whiskey that I really got into was sherried whiskey. I think that's probably true for a lot of people. I absolutely love a sherried influence in whiskey. Granted, these days I am kind of sensitive to it. If the cask completely overwhelms the distillate, I'm probably not going to be very complimentary. I'm probably not going to say a lot of nice things about it, but sherry is an influence when it's balanced, when it's integrated. Gosh, it's the bee's knees. Anyway, the first whiskey in that style that I really fell in love with today, it's kind of an obscure one. It's the Benriach 12, but it's not this one. It's not this one. It's this one. So this was the Benriach 12 matured in sherry wood. Long discontinued now. I still remember my first bottle of this stuff, and it had me completely over the moon. I'm sure I'd like it less now in retrospect. I don't think it's like the greatest whiskey ever, but at the time, it just checked all the boxes for me. It was sweet, it was creamy, it was satisfying, really good. Also, shout out to Bunnahabhain 12, which I got into at around the same time and was also a very integral, very important bottle for me along the way. So yeah, it was Benriach 12, it was Bunnahabhain 12. It was from there that I really fell in love with sherry. That's actually a weird way of phrasing it. It's not a girl. I'm not talking about a girl named Sherry that I was like physically and romantically attracted to. No, I'm talking about a style of whiskey that I was physically and romantically attracted to. Next up, we've got peated and sherried whiskeys, and back when I was getting started about 15 or so years ago, there wasn't a sea of options like there is today in this category, but one that stood out to me pretty much right away was Ardbeg Uigeadail. Now, yes, I could start off by complaining that it's not as good as it used to be, so I will. It's not as good as it used to be, but back in the day, maybe circa 2009, 2010, I remember thinking this stuff was just absolutely epic. I do think back at that time they were using older whiskeys in the mix. Regardless, I remember just thinking this was so complex and intense. Uigeadail was always peat first, sherry second. I would argue that it still is, but it always struck such a beautiful balance between those two elements. Tack onto that the fact that this was always a high ABV whiskey. Back then, I was all about cast strength. I was all about like intensity. I was a big flavor chaser. And yeah, the Uigeadail just did everything that I wanted it to do, especially at the time. And granted, even though it's not as good today, it's still a whiskey that's worthy of checking out. So there we go, Ardbeg Uigeadail. Special shout out to Lagavulin 16. Okay, so our next category, our third category, is straightforward peated whiskey. So it's kind of like a natural progression because I started off with sherry, then I got into sherry and peated whiskey, and finally this one is just peated whiskey. So it was a transition, like I transitioned from sherry to peat. Hold on. Now, I'd always had peated whiskey around ever since I started drinking whiskey, so it wasn't like a new concept for me, but I remember the bottle that really cemented that straightforward peat style as something that I needed to explore more, and that bottle was the Lagavulin 12, specifically Lagavulin 12 from 2011. Now, granted, prior to that, I did already enjoy peat. I loved stuff like Kalila 12. I remember the old Ardbeg 10s I absolutely loved back in the day, but yeah, Lagavulin 12 was a revelation, if I may be so poetic. It was big, it was intense, it was smoky and peaty and complex, and once again, I'm gonna be that guy. This stuff here is better than this stuff. Now, I haven't had this one, the newest one, but the last one I had was this one. Yeah, it was good, but it could not hold a candle to those earlier batches that I was having around early 2010s or so. Now, you might say I'm full of shit. You might say I'm wearing nostalgia goggles, and a couple of things there. One, look at my face. Clearly not wearing any goggles. And two, I've actually done the side by side. I had an older bottle from the early 2010s, and I had a more recent one, and it wasn't close. Anyway, I don't want to argue about that. The point is, Lagavulin is one of my favorite smoky whiskeys, one of my favorite peated house styles, and those earlier batches of the 12-year-old release really cemented that for me. So that was a big part of my whiskey journey, and it's what got me into the straightforward peated whiskeys. So that's it, Lagavulin 12. Special shout out once again though to Ardbeg 10. Next up, we're leveling up in our whiskey journey to aged and sophisticated, because after a few years of going through those more dramatic flavors, so we're looking for cast strength stuff, peaty stuff, sherried stuff, there comes a point where you start to appreciate more restraint, more nuance, more class, if you please. And the whiskey that got me hooked on that style was the Glen Livid 18, the old one at 43%. This was such a beautiful whiskey, and what really sold me on this one wasn't just that it absolutely was complex and sophisticated, but it was that it was also affordable. This was always one of the more affordable 18-year-olds on the market, and I remember with my first bottle of this, I remember thinking, how do they do that? This was so different from the style of whiskeys that I was previously into, which were always, intense or cast strength or very loud with dramatic flavors. And this one was more refined, it was more quiet, it was more complex. It was just a completely different experience. This was a bottle I came back to many times over the years. I still love it to this day. I think it's a fantastic whiskey. Unfortunately, a few years back, they switched out the 43% version for this one right here, which is now 40%. This is what's available now. And when they did that, a little piece of me died. Now, to be fair, I haven't tried the newer version. I'm not too excited to try the newer version when it's 40%. Not only is the ABV lower, but the price is now higher. So that's just not a good exchange. Now, if you've tried the newer one, you can let me know down below if it's like decent or worth picking up, but yeah, we'll see. As for this one, I did get a couple backup bottles because I knew this would be something that I would want to come back to over the years and that I'd miss it after it's now 40%. So yeah, that was my milestone whiskey for aged and sophisticated. We'll give a special shout out to the Balvenie 15 sherry single cask. Another good one. Our next category is coastal whiskeys, and my milestone whiskey here is Talisker 10. Now, Talisker 10 was not love at first sip. I'd had a couple bottles before. I always liked it. I always enjoyed it, but it wasn't until I was out at a local Taiwanese drinking spot with some friends, and one of my buddies told me to splash a little bit of the Talisker on an oyster, then eat the oyster, and that was the moment. I think having it with the oyster, with the seafood, really hammered home how wonderfully coastal Talisker is. So that's an idea for you guys if you haven't tried it. Don't get an expensive Talisker, like a cheap, Talisker 10, Talisker Storm, one of those. Splash a little bit on an oyster if you haven't tried it. It's delicious. Anyway, yeah, the coastal notes, the limestone, the rocks, the pepper, the gentle peat. There's nothing quite like a Talisker. I realize the older stuff is incredibly overpriced these days, and yes, the 10 isn't as good as it used to be, but I still love the Talisker House style. And yeah, this is it. This is the one. This is the bottle that sold me on Western Highland whiskeys, island whiskeys, coastal whiskeys, whatever you want to call it. Really good stuff, even to this day. Not as good, but still good. Also, we have a special shout out here, and this one goes to Old Pulteney 17. Unfortunately discontinued, but absolute banger. Next up, we've got a straightforward bourbon matured whiskey, the kind of style that I often call the purists whiskey. And the bottle that really sold me on this category was Glencairn 10. I remember having this for the first time and thinking, noise. This one is bright, it's delicate, it's clean, it's floral. This one had me charmed from the first time I tried it. And the good news about this one in particular is that I'm not going to complain that it's gone downhill or that it's not as good today. It's still awesome. I also want to give a special mention here to Aaron Quarter Cask, the Bothies. So not these ones here, the old version that looked like this. The new version, still really good, but the older ones I did prefer. Again, bright, clean, distillate-driven whiskeys, really good. Okay, so last category is dirty and funky, and this one, I like to be unpredictable, but this one is exactly what you expect it to be. It's going to be a Springbank with that sort of like farmy, rugged character. I think unlike most people who probably got started off by the 10-year-old, the one that really caught my eye first, or caught my attention first, was the 12. The 12 has traditionally been more of a sherry forward profile. I know that's not always the case, but for the most part, when I first got into the 12-year-olds, our bottles looked like this. It was always a very batchy whiskey. It was always a very interesting whiskey. Yeah, I mean, I don't think much needs to be said about Springbank that we don't already know. It's a rugged, farmy, funky whiskey. It's an interesting whiskey, and it's what got me into the style. Special shout out goes to Ben Nevis 10. Okay, so that was it. That was my list of milestone whiskeys. Most of these are still available, and most of these I do still recommend. Although we did notice a bit of a theme here, didn't we? I definitely said on more than one occasion that the new iterations of these bottles are not as good as they used to be, and I think we can take that as proof positive that I'm a grumpy old f***. Anyway, curmudgeon or not, I want to hear about your milestone whiskeys. So what are some bottles that really set you in a direction, that really sold you on a particular style of whiskey? So it's a fun little trip down memory lane, and yeah, I'm curious. Put those down below. Anyway, for those of you who stuck around to find out what the mystery pour is here in the glass, this, as I mentioned earlier, is a world whiskey. It's a pretty good one. And if you know anything about me, if you've been watching the channel for a while, then you probably know that I live in Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, is home to some of the world's most famous distilleries. We get stuff like Kavalan, Omar to a lesser degree, but yeah, there's a lot of great whiskey coming out of Taiwan. So it makes sense that the first world whiskey that I really got into was Amrut Intermediate Sherry out of India. Now this one was very hyped up, I think, 12, 13, 14 years ago, way back, and I could not find it in Taiwan. I had to order it in from the UK, and I remember from the moment I popped it, this stuff blew me away. Now what I have in the glass here, it's just a sample, but it's from a newer version. The newer version looks like this, and it's fine, but it's not quite as good. It's not nearly as good as it used to be. Thing is, I haven't had a bottle of this stuff in well over a dozen years, so I can't tell you exactly how this compares to that stuff that I initially had. All I can say is that I enjoy it less. That might be the whiskey, it might be me, but it's different. It's still good, but I don't think I need a full bottle. Still, it was a very important bottle for me just because from there I started exploring more Indian whiskeys. I got into Taiwanese whiskeys, Japanese whiskeys, and I just started branching out a little bit more. So it is the bottle that really got me into world whiskey. And yeah, I guess that's it. That's the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you want to help out the channel, I've got the Patreon. Otherwise, like, comment, subscribe, and I'm looking forward to reading your comments about your milestone whiskeys. We'll catch you next time. Bye, guys.